pathway inhibitors. And I will describe briefly the results of the RESONATE trial. Nowadays, the gold standard of upfront treatment of CLL patients is represented by chemoimmunotherapy, with patients who receive FCR and patients with comorbidities chlorambucil in combination with anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody. For patients who relapse after first-line treatment, there are not really standardized options. As all you know, amongst the options of atumelumab, a humanized anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody provides approximately a 50% overall response rate. As we have heard in previous talks, targeting BTK is a rational approach to improve upon these results. And ibrutinib, a first-in-class orally available irreversible covalent inhibitor of BTK that has shown in phase 1, 1B, and 2 clinical trials an excellent tolerability and safety profile and an impressive overall response rate of around 70%, even in patients with the presence of deletion 17, forms the basis of this clinical trial published in May of 2014 in New England Journal of Medicine. This is a multi-center, open-label, industry-sponsored phase 3 study that was carried out in 67 centers in the US, Australia, and 7 European locations. 391 patients were randomized to receive with resistant or relapsing CLL, SLL, were randomized to either ibrutinib or ofatumumab. The primary endpoint of the study was progression-free survival, and the overall survival and overall response rate were the secondary endpoints as assessed by an independent review committee according to the International Working Group on CLL criteria, except for the presence of lymphocytosis. They were recruited between June 2012 and April 2013. 195 patients received of ibrutinib 400 milligrams once daily until progression of other adverse events, and 196 received of atumelumab, 12 doses in 24 weeks. The first week, the dose was 300 milligrams, then weekly, 7 times 200 milligrams, and then 4 more doses every 4 weeks to complete the 4 weeks of treatment. The patients were stratified by relapse or resistance, resistance defined as no response or relapse in less than a year of the primary treatment, and by the presence of the lesion 17. And the follow-up was every 12 weeks. FISH, beta-2 microglobulin, and mutational analysis were performed at a central reference laboratory. The characteristics of the patients were well balanced. Only a third had a serious score or more than 6, and most of them had an adequate performance status. This is a slight bias of the study because they tend to recruit patients who are in a better shape, I would say. Most of them had the lesion 17, approximately a third in each group. Most of them were also heavily pretreated. The majority had received previous treatment with purine analogs, alkylating agents, and an anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody, as you can see on the slide. And the median time from the last treatment was, in most cases, less than a year. Ibrutinib significantly prolonged PFS with a median that was not reached at the median follow-up of 9.4 months of the study, as compared with a median of PFS of 8.1 months for the ofatumumab group. This led to a 78% reduction in the risk of progression or death. Also, ibrutinib significantly prolonged the rate of overall survival with a hazard ratio for death of 0.43. That represents a 57% reduction in the risk of death And this was despite the fact that 57 patients on the ofatumumab group had been crossed to receive ibrutinib. The difference in overall survival supporting the superiority of ibrutinib was preserved in all the subgroup, as is very clearly shown in this slide. With respect to toxicity, you see that the most frequent non-hematological effects that occur in at least 20% of the patients were basically fatigue, diarrhea, that was much more common in the ibrutinib group. Very interestingly, and surely will be discussed later on in the day, there was atrial fibrillation present in 10 patients in the ibrutinib group as compared to only 1 in the ofatumumab arm. Also, bleeding-related adverse events, the majority grade 1, were more common in the ibrutinib arm, 44% versus 12% in the control arm. But there was no difference in major hemorrhagic events, and only 2 patients in the ibrutinib arm presented a major hemorrhagic event, including 1 subdural hemorrhage that led to discontinuation of the drug. The conclusions made in this study is that in this population of patients with relapsed CLL, SLL, ibrutinib was superior to ofatumumab with respect to PFS, overall survival, and response rate at a median follow-up of 9.4 months. The benefit was seen regardless of adverse prognostic factors such as the lesion 17. Significant overall survival benefit despite the crossover of 57 patients after progression on ofatumumab. Ibrutinib was associated with expected toxic effects that did not result in frequent dose reductions or discontinuation. The potential reasons for the higher rate of atrial fibrillation are being investigated. Mild bleeding episodes were more common in the ibrutinib group, but only 2 had major bleeding. This will set the stage for the discussion of 2 more studies that will discuss the introduction of earlier ibrutinib in the front setting, and also, as Dr. Wilson pointed out, combined with chemotherapy, because maybe that way we will avoid the necessity to continue indefinitely with this type of medications. Thank you very much.
Winda? So, you know, this trial was a regulatorily driven trial. And I think for all of you who treat CLL, hopefully you would agree that ofatumumab's activity as a second-line therapy is actually very poor. And in fact, I was the ODAC, I was serving on ODAC, and I was the only heme person there that voted against approval of this drug because the effects in rituximab failures was extremely small. And in my view, much of it was being driven by the criteria that the CLL groups had actually taken on to define a response. They, at the time that ofatumumab came up, they were not scanning people. There was not a rigorous criteria for correction of counts. There were many, many problems. So ofatumumab is not a very good drug, quite honestly, for relapsed CLL. And again, the reason why this trial was done was because it is regulatorily in the United States approved for this setting, and so that's why they randomized against this. The fact that ibrutinib, which is a great drug, beat it is of no surprise. But I think this really points out that as the FDA moves forward, they really need to, I think, ask for clinically relevant studies. And I don't think this is a clinically relevant study.
Is in some ways, Wyndham, is this basically a control arm? You know, you can't do placebo-controlled trials. Is it basically, in some ways, saying, look, is there a really standard that would have beat it? And if there's not, is it really a way to do a placebo-controlled trial without using a placebo.
No, I mean, it is in many ways essentially that, but they used it because ofatumumab was regulatorily
Correct.
approved for this setting.
Correct. Yeah, which is, again, it's a balance between, clinically relevant and regulatorily, because you can't get it regulatory proof, you can't get it on.
Yeah, in principle, I fully agree with you. I think that we just have to think historically. So at that time, there was nothing. So it is true that nobody of us really trusted ofatumumab, and it entered the armamentarium just because it was approved, not because we had any evidence. I personally I don't think I ever treated a patient with ofatumumab, also because there was a story of Campat being resistant to Camp and so on. But the problem at that time, there was nothing else. So I did also the kind of review historically. I mean, bendamustine was not providing any better, in that particular setting, was not providing any better outcome. I mean, it was like, again, 12, 14 months. So at the end, it is true that if you had to pick a control in the relapsed refractory setting in CLL, in that year, ofatumumab would have not been worse than anything else. Nowadays, of course, and after that trial, was clear that it was completely wrong.
Carlos?
Well, just a joke, but we have to say that the comparison with the Idela with rituximab is much worse.
Yeah.
Well, so let me comment to Wyndham's comments. Since I'm an investigator on that trial, I totally agree with your sentiment regarding this is done for a regulatory reason. Yeah, but and I'm not somebody who likes ofatumumab and ever used ofatumumab, but I put patients on this trial even though they were randomized, and there was no crossover allowed during the trial, only after it was fully accrued. So I rolled the dice on some of my patients, taking the chance that hopefully they would get randomized to ibrutinib. But these are not favorable risk patients. These are patients who've been through a lot of treatment, and there was nothing else reasonable to offer them. We're fooling ourselves to think, oh, we're going to give them this combination of chemotherapy and it's going to do any benefit. So I think that there's great value to this trial, and even with your caveats, I would have certainly voted to approve it based on this data. It is just far superior than anything else we could have given any of these patients. And so even with that concern, you couldn't come up with a randomized trial for this patient population at that point in time. You couldn't have designed one different than this that would have met your concerns. So it's very impressive. People did better and lived longer, even with all the caveats about ofatumumab.
So I think your points are very well taken. I think, though, the point I was trying to make is that this control arm really was a regulatory arm and not a serious comparison of a alternative therapy.
What would the comparison have been? So are you suggesting that you just don't do any trial because you can't?
No. I am just saying that for physicians reading this, they should understand that this was done for regulatory purposes, and not that anyone ever thought the ofatumumab arm was going to really give you much. Quite honestly, with this kind of data, a large phase 2 would have probably given you would have given you a good result. But there's this whole notion for full approval that you need a randomized study, again being driven by a regulatory setting. But there will be situations where a drug, at least from phase 2 data, is so good that it almost becomes unethical to randomize it against something that you don't think is going to work. And I just wanted to point out here that the survival difference was relatively small. Now, I understand that 57% ultimately got ibrutinib, but that's a very different thing than actually mandating that everybody cross over to it at the time that they need therapy. And so the survival advantage here might have been well, would have been smaller even, and it still wasn't that great. Again, I'm not saying that this is not a fine trial. What I'm saying is that this is not about comparing ibrutinib to ofatumumab, because it might as just as well have been, you know, dealer's choice.
But it is showing the effectiveness of ibrutinib in this patient population. And so to vote not to approve it, I think was just plain wrong.
No.
Wilson, Wyndham.
Wait,
It's just plain wrong.
wait. I voted not to approve ofatumumab, not this.
Oh, I see. I apologize.
No.
So,
No.
Okay.
Let me be very clear about this.
yeah, well, I agree with you on that.
No.
I agree with you
Can
on
we-
that.
I voted on the ofatumumab,
Which,
not this.
which I think this brings just a question kind
Yeah.
of for the group that I'd like to hear is that, you know, again, and I think the point on the control arm, it's very difficult. In fact, as we get into relapse refractory settings, control arms get very, very difficult to kind of figure out what is inappropriate in the setting, that you're doing no harm, that you may be giving an opportunity. But from the Latin American, you know, from your centers and your thoughts, is a trial like this, seeing the data, it be, you know, with the caveats we heard with ofatumumab, is this still something that you feel is relevant, you know, when you're looking at this drug and saying, yes, I would like this for my patients? Again, is there any concerns about the control arm or this trial in terms of saying, yes, I want the availability for my patients with CLL? Again, from any of the centers, you know, or is a control arm irrelevant?
I always say that
You're not Latin America.
Well, I'm going to say, I think that the
The only
data is
Latin.
impressive, and as we will hear later on, I mean, it stands for the trials. But one of my concerns, and probably you that participate in the trial can answer this, many of these patients have comorbidities, cardiac problems, atrial fibrillation, and I heard that several patients in this study were already on anticoagulants, and a great concern is the problem of atrial fibrillation and bleeding. Can you comment on that, on the
Sure.
safety issues?
So basically, we knew how effective the drug was, of course, from the earlier trials, from the original trial, the 1102 trial, for these heavily pretreated patients. So I have a patient that I'm evaluating that I know with certainty will not benefit from any standard therapy I give them. And I know from working with idelalisib or CAL-101 at the time and with ibrutinib that these drugs will work. So we didn't know about the atrial fibrillation issue until this trial, actually. So I don't care if somebody's on an anticoagulant, is an antiplatelet agent, and has atrial fibrillation. The risk benefit there is so far in favor of treating their CLL and making them live longer than taking the risk of whatever risk there is of them being on those other agents. It's a very different scenario than if you have that patient who's previously untreated and you're making a decision about using one of these agents. But these relapse refractory patients would have been dead in a matter of weeks if they didn't get these therapies. So if I had a patient with a platelet count of 10,000, I would have started the drug because I know it's safe. So, it's having the knowledge from the earlier experience that gave us confidence to put those kinds of patients on this trial.
actually I treated a patient with 10,000 platelets in the named patient program. I asked permission to Janssen. Wonderful. After 4 weeks, 100,000.
So John, I just want to address the question. So somewhere between 30 and 50% of the patients in the ibrutinib registration trials are taking anticoagulants or antiplatelets. So almost half of our patients in our trial across the hundreds and hundreds of patients are taking anticoagulants and antiplatelets. So there's no specific reason to avoid using antiplatelet or an anticoagulant with ibrutinib. There is a potential for a higher risk of grade 1 bruising and petechiae, but we've not seen any association with a higher risk of grade 3, grade 4 hemorrhage. So there's no contraindication for anticoagulants or antiplatelets. However you would normally use them, you should use them the same. However you would monitor your patients in terms of risk, you should monitor them the same. I think that's clear. So it's not there's no absence of information around ibrutinib and antiplatelets and anticoagulants.
Steve, can I just make a quick comment on the issue of the comparator arm of studies? Because I think this is a very important point. I mean, we could argue forever on that, but undoubtedly, I mean, you brought up this study, but I mean, if you look at the idelalisib, I mean, Carlos mentioned this. I mean, I don't know if I would have managed to go through my ethical committee.
There was the crossover.
I know, no, definitely. But having said that, I mean, to offer placebo and rituximab in relapsed CLL is not exactly what I think many of us would give in a relapsed patient. You talk about Resonate 2, I mean, even that could be questionable. These are patients 65 years old. The control arm is clorambucil alone. So, I mean, I'm saying this because I think it's an important point, is particularly since these drugs are so valid. I mean, in a way, they are even reducing the validity of so important drugs. That's all I'm saying. It's a very important issue because they're obviously for approval reasons, and probably studies that we would not design ourselves if we actually involved directly in it, which I think is something to keep in mind. So,
You reach a point where some of these drugs are so critically active that it almost becomes unethical if you actually have these studies. I do think that if you have a crossover, then I think it makes it a much more, ethical study. But when you don't have crossovers, that's where I kind of felt like this trial was perhaps, that's really my biggest issue, is I think it should have had a crossover. There was enough evidence this drug was so life-saving.
That was,
But
we fought bitterly with the FDA to allow that study to have a crossover, because remember, the primary endpoint of the study is progression-free survival, wasn't overall survival. So by allowing a crossover design, you do not influence the primary endpoint of the trial, and they refused. They refused. So like I said, for some of my patients, I had to roll the dice. Because I knew that ofatumumab wouldn't have done much for them. But, you had no choice.
50-50 to get the
Yeah,
control.
the rituximab issue, just to deal with that with idelalisib, I'll talk about this later. Absolutely. I have no interest in giving a relapsed patient single-agent rituximab. But I enrolled in that trial because I need to get my patients one of these drugs. And that trial had a crossover. More to the point, though, in the U.S., 30% of those patients that you saw in that trial in community practice would get single-agent rituximab, okay? So they're dealing with, so in a way, it was a very clever design because they're dealing with the reality of how patients are treated. And if a physician says, I'm going to give my patient single-agent rituximab, and they see a trial where adding another drug to it gives benefit, that resonates with them.
That wouldn't apply outside the U.S. That's very interesting, but that's exactly happening. The single rituximab is not something that outside the U.S. would be used.
Yeah, if I may just add one quick thing. I think the point of all this discussion is not really the comparator of ofatumumab rituximab, is indeed the fact that FDA asked for randomized trial, which is true that indeed, for example, idelalisib was approved with a very good phase 2 trial in follicular lymphoma. So that was enough. So I just to give hope, I think that the regulatory agency are learning. So something is changing, and they also learn from the fact that ofatumumab was not a good drug, and it's not, and it should be used. Only one more thing. The other point is that the problem of doing randomized trials with one non-effective drug is something that belongs to the past, because fortunately now we have very nice drugs. And indeed, for example, I'm enrolling patients in the study, ibrutinib versus Acerta product, which is fine. I mean, my patients will be happy anyhow, so who cares? Yeah. So that's the thing.
And I do, not to be the defender of the FDA, but I do think they're learning in the solid tumors, PFS on a biomarker-driven, targeted therapy, they're actually approving drugs. I think they're getting away. I think when you start getting that, so I do think they're kind of learning that we don't need to do this
If I
anymore.
may say one more thing, in fact, for the Resonate 2, as I was part of the steering committee, we fought with the FDA and said we should have the crossover or any of the second study. It's not possible to do any more a Resonate 1 because investigator will not allow. And in fact, so I think there is some discussion. But
Yeah, but I just want to comment from a company perspective. All we can do is do the comparator arm that the FDA will consider as appropriate, and it is frustrating from our side, right? Because we have to listen to the regulator. Wyndham, I agree with you. However, here's a caveat: when we go to Anvisa in Brazil, if we did not have a randomized trial, they would not approve that drug. Period. If we went with them a large phase 2, they would say you need a randomized phase 3. However unpalatable that is, same thing in Argentina as well. We need the randomized trials because they're outside of FDA and EMEA. Regulators require it. The frustrating thing is what is considered an appropriate comparator.
no, that's exactly, I think, the point. So it's frustrating also, even more for us as scientist investigator, that science doesn't count. So if a regulatory agency, any, asks for a randomized trial, we have to do it. You have to do it. And sometimes it was a nonsense. Now, luckily,